guys, welcome to week 39. We are in the New Testament. How are you feeling? I wanted to bring up a few things this week that I hope will be helpful. The first one, why are there four Gospels? What's that even about? We have four stories about Jesus, and what's the purpose? I think there are a couple of things we need to think of with that become very useful to us, especially as we want to dive into apologetics, for example, defending our faith. One, we often think of the Bible as one storybook that's been put together and it's one source by itself. And so then we say, oh, that's documented in the Bible, but that's not documented anywhere else. Therefore, it must not be true. The Bible's not one source by itself. We've compiled it into one book, but it's actually 66 different sources that are primary documents that have been written by people in their times from their perspectives based on their experiences with God and with their world. And so when you see the four Gospels, you see acted out some of the stuff that the Bible actually says, that everything should be backed up by the testimony of two or three witnesses, that you can't accept anything if it doesn't have the testimony of at least two or three witnesses. And so you have the Gospels. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what are called the synoptic Gospels, which just means that they see together, that they have a very similar narrative structure, and it would appear that maybe they used each other as a source, something like that. And then you have John, which is a very different kind of story. It's arranged very differently. So some of the things that you can see, Luke, for example, he's writing clearly after Matthew and Mark, because in the very beginning of Luke, he says to Theophilus, I've decided to set these things in order for you. He says, many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of these things which have been fulfilled among us. And he says that eyewitnesses and servants of the word or ministers of the word have shared these things with us. And so he said, inasmuch as this has happened, it seemed good to me to write my own account for you, Theophilus. And so you see here is the perspective of someone who's a second generation believer. He himself has heard from eyewitnesses and he's heard from other people, and apparently he's already consulted other texts. This is rather important because a lot of people say that there was a very long oral tradition of the Bible and of the Gospels. And if there was a very long oral tradition where people are just saying it and not writing it down from the beginning, then maybe it's not very accurate. But here's Luke, and he's writing as a second generation believer. He traveled with Paul. He was there in the first century, present with eyewitnesses. And he says already many people have tried to write this down. So that tells us that there was actually a very early textual tradition. That's pretty important. And so you see Luke, he's got this perspective. He's a Gentile. He's a doctor. He's a historian. And it seems to me that he's writing to his friend Theophilus in both Luke and Acts to give Theophilus something solid to hold on to base his faith on, or perhaps so that Theophilus, who is a God lover, can become a person who has faith in Jesus Christ. These could be apologetic works. And so you see Luke has a really excellent emphasis on history, dates. He's obviously done lots of research because he can say this and this person were in power when this thing happened. And that helps us when we try to date the Bible, because we can go back and we can find other primary sources. We can find documents with their names on them. We can find coins with their names on them, monuments that they made with their name and their image on them. So that gives us a strong historical base to think about when we look at what happened in the gospel. So Luke's very good history. Matthew, he's writing to the Jews. People have said that Matthew perhaps wrote his gospel first in Hebrew or Aramaic, and then it was translated into Greek. I personally disagree, partially because there's no evidence that ever existed. There's no historical evidence. There's no text anywhere. And because I've worked in more than one language in my life. And so one of the things that I understand about when you want to write something in another language that is perhaps not your original language, you carry your style into what you write. So when I write in Spanish, for example, I write like an American writing in Spanish. I use American idioms. I use American sentence structure. I use American just directness. So I don't write in flowery sort of indirect words like someone who is a native speaker. I don't use the same sort of formalities as a native speaker. I write like an American who speaks Spanish. Perhaps well, but still like an American. And so I think that's what's going on with Matthew. You have someone whose first language is probably Hebrew or Aramaic, and he's writing a gospel in Greek. Therefore, it has his style from his own personal language that he's writing in. His personal background is coming through into that. And so you see his emphasis on Old Testament prophecy, quotations from the Old Testament. You see a lot of emphasis on numbers. Frequently, he makes reference to those kinds of things because he's writing in a Jewish context. You have Mark. People think that perhaps he was writing to the Romans. His gospel is very straight to the point. One of the most common words in his gospel is the word euthus, which means immediately. Immediately this happened. Immediately this happened. And so he's writing perhaps to a nation with a short attention span. A nation that is perhaps not interested in babies, and that's why he doesn't have a birth narrative. That could be some of what's going on. And so then you also have John. John does a very interesting thing because he says, I've written these things so that the whole world may believe. His gospel is written for the whole world. And he actually does a very interesting thing in the middle of that where he opens up his book with a discussion of the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. And so Jesus is the Logos. In Greek philosophy, the Logos was also called the demiurge. And it was a spiritual being, a sort of a god. And so it made the world, it made matter out of nothing. And so it actually was seen as an evil thing because in Platonic thought, matter and physical things are evil. And so you have this demiurge that made an evil world because he's evil and he was messing around with matter. John repurposes this idea and he says that Jesus is the Word. He's the Word that made the worlds. And he didn't make it because he's evil and he's tied to matter. He made it because he is good and he wanted to be the light for the world. And so he made this world and then he's the light for it. Everything that's here has come through him. He's good. What he's made is good and he has a good purpose for it. And so that's when you see you actually have 4 distinctly different sources, primary documents written by people who either were there or were talking specifically to people who were there or had been through part of it, and each one gives a slightly different perspective and it's written for a different purpose. There are 4 different sources that back each other up historically, giving us a very accurate view of what actually happened in Jesus's life. When they have so much agreement among them, it's because they saw the same things. Not because there's some other random source running around or because they got together and conspired to write something much after the time. When they write the same thing, it's because they saw the same thing happen. That makes a lot of sense, I think, when you see different people writing about a historical event because they were there. Their ideas of that event might be slightly different, but it's the same event. That's obvious. So I hope that's helpful. Another one. Why is Matthew's genealogy different from Luke's genealogy? What's going on with the numbers? So Matthew's genealogy, it's tracing Jesus' lineage back through Joseph and Joseph's family all the way back to David and then back to Abraham. Luke's genealogy traces Mary's genealogy, her fathers and their fathers, back to David again through Nathan instead of Solomon, and then from Nathan all the way down to Adam. Why? Abraham is the father of the Jews. Matthew's writing to the Jews. Luke is writing to the Gentiles and the whole world. So he's going back to the father of the whole world, which is Adam. So that's the kind of foundation that they're laying. What's going on with Matthew and the numbers? And so I looked this up. There's a guy named Louis A. Barbieri Jr., and he wrote a commentary on Matthew. It's in the Bible Knowledge Commentary if you're interested. And he talks about how Matthew obviously did not list every individual in the genealogy between Abraham and David, between David and the exile, and between the exile and Jesus. Instead, he listed only 14 generations in each of these time periods. Jewish reckoning did not require every name in order to satisfy a genealogy. But why did Matthew select 14 names in each period? Perhaps the best solution is that the name David in Hebrew, in Hebrew numerology, added up to 14. So if they take the values of those letters, that there is a numerical value, and they add up to 14. Matthew's genealogy answered the important questions a Jew would rightfully ask about anyone who claimed to be a king of the Jews. Is he a descendant of David through the rightful line of succession? Matthew answered yes. And so you see there's 14, 14, and 14, and Matthew makes a big deal out of that. Does that mean that we need to go messing around with numerology and paying attention to every single number? No, Matthew is using it here as an apologetic tool to write to his own nation that he understands because he's one of them. That doesn't mean we need to go messing around with numerology and thinking that it has to be something of eternal significance for us. This was an apologetic tool. So I hope that helps. What's the division of Abijah in Luke 1 through 5? John A. Martin's commentary in the Bible Knowledge Commentary says this division was one of 24 groups of priests drawn up in David's time. So that goes back to 1 Chronicles 24, 7 through 18. Abijah was one of them. The priests in each division were on duty twice a year for a week at a time. Zechariah was of the division of Abijah, and then Zechariah was chosen by lot to be the priest. Because of this large number of priests, this would be the only time in his life that he would be allowed to perform this task. So they would cast lots. They would get somebody from each of the divisions, all 24 divisions, and they would like draw lots. So the guy that gets the short stick, he gets that particular role. And so Zechariah, and this is just the sovereignty of God, according to this guy, Zechariah draws this lot the one time in his life that he will be able to do this. And this was as close as you could get to God if you weren't the high priest. Like for them to be able to come to the golden altar of incense in front of the veil inside the temple and offer incense, prayer to God, was as close to as you could get to God. And so Zechariah gets this once in a lifetime honor, and it's that day that Gabriel comes down and speaks to him and says he's going to have a son. And so you just see the sovereignty of God and his great plan, the way that he's putting those things in motion for John to come before Jesus, for Mary and Elizabeth as cousins, and then Jesus and John as cousins to have this ministry together. It's all God's plan. So that's the division of Abijah. I already talked about Luke and dating. Luke 2:36 talks about Anna being 7 years from her virginity in the New King James. That is a weird phrase. So what does it mean? Likely she had been widowed after 7 years of marriage. So her virginity stops at marriage, and then she's married for 7 years, and then she's a widow until she's 84. So that's probably the best, clearest explanation of what's going on there. Another one, Matthew chapter 2, wise men from the east, star, Herod killing children. What's going on? The wise men could have been Persian or Babylonian. Both had a strong historical connection with Israel. Both had very strong traditions of wise men. And then the Jews could have shared their prophecies with both groups over the course of their exile in both of those countries. One interesting possibility for the star, and this comes from Barbieri, he says the star that they had seen in the east now reappeared and led them to a specific house in Bethlehem where they found the child Jesus. Bethlehem is about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Stars, or planets, naturally travel from east to west across the heavens, not from north to south. Could it be that the star that the Magi saw, and which led them to the specific house, was the Shekinah glory of God? That same glory had led the children of Israel through the wilderness for 40 years as a pillar of fire and cloud. Perhaps this is what they saw in the east, and for want of a better term, they called it a star. All other efforts to explain this star are inadequate, such as a conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, or a supernova or a comet. I just thought that was very interesting in terms of possibilities for what this star could be if they didn't understand what God's pillar of fire looked like and it appeared in the sky. Maybe they would have thought it was a star. Maybe this was God's way of showing my pillar of fire, my glory is back on earth again. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting, so that's free. As to the identity of the men of the East, nobody knows who they are or how many they were. We've got traditions from all over the world of Christendom, like early Christendom, where they would say, like, these are 3 guys and they have these 3 different names. And so it's like Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar, or there's totally different names if you go down to Ethiopia. And so people thought that there were 3 because there are 3 gifts. We know that does not mean that there were only 3 men. So that's just a tradition. It's not very historically dependable. As to Herod killing children, we don't see this recorded anywhere else outside of Matthew that we know of. We could always discover new things. We don't see that anywhere outside of Matthew. And so there are some people who say, oh, this is obviously fictitious. Matthew is just a storyteller. He likes to invent things. There is some sort of circumstantial evidence for what happened beyond just like, we ought to just believe the Bible because it's the Bible. Because God's word is true. But beyond that, you see where this would have been very much in character for Herod. He was known to have had his own children killed, had several of his wives killed because he thought that they might be conspiring against him. So this is not like a sane, rational, kind, gentle sort of a guy. This is a I kill my own family members out of paranoia kind of guy. So it wouldn't be beyond him at all to have done this to these children in Bethlehem. It's also likely that there were actually not a lot of children under 2 in Bethlehem at that time. Bethlehem was not a very big place. And so, if this is happening in sort of an isolated area of Judea, it may not be something that gets the attention of the empire. They wrote about Herod killing his children because they were members of the royal family. But if you have a bunch of small children from families that are maybe poor and nobody cares about them, that doesn't get the attention of the empire. And that may be why we don't see it written about in other places. We do know Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, had said that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son because the pig had a better chance of survival. So it would be very much within Herod's character to kill a bunch of children. We don't have a real reason to doubt that text. Another one, demons and the devil in the Gospels. It's really interesting. I started reading this as I was preparing for these, and I've been in the Old Testament for so long, but I've been reading it in large quantities, and so I've been catching themes and just the feel of it. And then I get into the New Testament, and immediately it's the devil tempted Jesus, and then there were demons, and he's casting out demons, and I'm like, this is not something that shows up frequently in the Old Testament. So what's going on here? J.I. Packer and M.C. Tenney wrote a book called The Illustrated Manners and Customs of the Bible, and they attribute this sudden emphasis on demons to a Persian influence. They say that the Jews of the diaspora became fascinated with demons and angels. They qualified the biblical belief in a creator who has sovereign control over his creation by adopting a Persian view of the universe with an elaborate spirit world and an ongoing war between the forces of light and of darkness. So apparently they said this kind of thing starts to pop up quite a bit in the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. And so we do see that the Pharisees already had a well-formed tradition of and sort of a familiarity with exorcisms, because it pops up in Acts 19, 13 through 16, the 7 sons of Sceva, and then also in Matthew 12, 27, when Jesus says, if you think I'm casting out demons by the ruler of demons, who do your sons cast them out by? So there already was this tradition. But could we make an argument that this is not actually a Persian addition? Maybe this is something that goes further and deeper into the Old Testament? I think so. We see the Gospels dealing with individuals in a different way from how the Old Testament deals with them. So if I were to say, to qualify these two things as history, in the Old Testament, the concern of the text is mostly large-scale history between Israel and God. It's zooming in on leaders, prophets. It's sort of a political, theological history. It doesn't tend to be social history. The New Testament immediately zooms in on the lives of individuals in the street as they interact with John the Baptist and Jesus as individuals. It has a much greater aspect of social history. It deals with individuals of low social status or education, commoners, children, pagans, servants, women, the ill, and the poor. And this is why maybe we see more strains of traditional or folk religion, and those things are popping up. Additionally, in the Old Testament, the worship of demons were present in a different sense in their society. So by the time you get to Jesus, they have drawn away from idols. But in the Old Testament, they were worshiping demons intentionally. And so they were showing up in society in a different way, in sort of a state-ordained way, especially as a lot of the kings would lead in this kind of worship. And so we see that they were in the high places in other areas, but we see in Leviticus 17:7, Deuteronomy 32:17, 2 Chronicles 11:15, in Psalms 106:37, it says specifically, when you're worshiping these things, you are worshiping demons. You're offering sacrifices to demons. And so what we're seeing in the Old Testament is we're seeing demons come out on a state level, as the people as a whole worship them. And in the New Testament, we see demons coming out on an individual level. And another just flavor to this, it's one of the things that we see in the Old Testament that echoes into the New, and that people would consult mediums, diviners, and spiritists. And so I looked this up, and some of the words that they are using in there, they talk about people that have familiar spirits. And if you look down into the roots of the Hebrew, the spirits are like python spirits, exactly like in Acts 16, where this girl has a python spirit, or as our Bibles translate it, a spirit of divination. But these people actually had snake spirits that were their familiars, even in the Old Testament, in cultures that weren't Greek. And so we do see these things echoed throughout the Old Testament. I don't think we have to say that all of the perspective of the New Testament was heavily influenced by Persia. I do think that it has a background that is biblical. And so then one last thing, John 4:9, it says, "Then the woman of Samaria said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.'" And this was just interesting. Edwin A. Blum talks about this in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. He says the NIV margin gives an alternate translation to the Greek sentence with the word synkrontai, which means to associate or use together. As in, the Jews do not use dishes Samaritans have used. This rendering may well be correct. A rabbinic law of AD 66 stated that Samaritan women were considered as continually menstruating and unclean. Therefore, a Jew who drank from a Samaritan woman's vessel would become ceremonially unclean. And this is why it's so radical that Jesus is going and talking to this woman and asking for her for a drink. He's asking to participate in her uncleanness. She knows that. And that's radical because here's God walking around in the streets and he does not care about that kind of reputation because he knows what's clean and not clean. And he's the one that makes the unclean clean. And that's what he's doing with her. And so I just wanted to share that because I just thought that was really neat. So I hope this helps you this week. Have a great week and I'll see you next week.